Hi, it's Feature from Sewmate. Welcome to my channel. If you want to see how I make this beautiful A-line yoked skirt, please stay tuned. You will need your A-line skirt block to do this, both back and front. So I've got a tutorial on this channel on how you can make one. I'll leave a link in the description below and a link above as well. So we're going to start with drafting our skirt back. So trace around the block as usual. Lift your block. Now measure and mark down for your yoke depth. I'm going to be using 15 centimeters for this, so just follow through your waistline like I'm doing here. Now I'm putting down my grain line for the yoke, and it's going to be parallel to the center back. And I'm putting a grain line on bias for my main skirt to add interest to the skirt design. Now labeling the yoke, back yoke, cut 2 pairs plus 1 pair fusing or interfacing, and I put my initial. Adding notches there. Add a balanced notch there as well. Now onto labeling the main skirt, back skirt. Cut 1 pair and I put my initial. Now cut around your skirt like I'm doing here. Get a fresh pattern paper so that we can add seam allowances to the joining there. Tape it on and add a 1 centimeter seam allowance right round that joining. Transfer your notch to the edge, adding notches there and cut around your pattern. Do the same to the main skirt, tape it on. And add a 1 centimeter seam allowance there. Transfer the notch to the edge as well and cut around your pattern. Moving on to the front skirt. Trace around your block as usual. Lift your block. Now measure and mark down for your yoke depth again, which is 15 centimeters for mine. Just reshape the curve there. Put a balancing notch and put notches for your waist tie depth. I'm using 7 centimeters. Adding notches around the pattern. Be putting my yoke center front on fold, and I'm putting my grain line for the yoke, which is parallel to the center front, and labeling front yoke, cut 2 on fold plus 1 fusing on fold, and I put my initial. Now adding notches. For my main skirt, I'm gonna be putting my grain line on bias again and labeling the main skirt, front skirt, cut 1 on fold, and I put my initial. I'm gonna be putting the center front on fold too. Cut around the skirt. Now I'm gonna add seam allowances to the joining like we did with the back as well. 1 centimeter seam allowances. Transferring the notch to the edge and cut around the pattern. Do the same with the main skirt, just making sure that it's 1 centimeter there. Tape it on. transferring the notch to the edge and cutting around the pattern. Now moving on to making the waist ties, get a fresh pattern paper and fold it in half. Now square a straight line that's equivalent to your waist tie width. Measure and mark a few more points with the same amount like I'm doing here. Now measure your waist tie length along the fold line there. I'm using 60 centimeters and put a mark. Square a line from the end there and just connect these lines like I'm doing with a straight line. Now add seam allowances right round. I'm using 1 centimeter seam allowance. Cut around the pattern. Now open your pattern and just transfer those straight lines across like I'm doing here, and add a grain line in between the paper like I'm doing here as well. Now onto labeling the pattern. Waist tie, cut 2 plus 2 fusing, and I put my initial, adding notches there. Just adding notches around all my pattern pieces. Now our patterns are finished and we're moving on to sewing. So now we're moving on to sewing our skirt. So what you need are your patterns, nice fabric and zipper, and I've got my usual cutting tools as well. So let's move on to cutting. So I've finished with cutting all the pattern pieces for our skirt. So the first step for us to do is to interface our waist ties. Okay, so we've got 2 waist ties and I've got 2 interfacing for the same size. So I'm just gonna do that now. Okay, so that's done, and I went ahead and ironed them halfway lengthwise. Okay, now turn your waistband to the wrong side like this, and then just pin them along. Now take them to your sewing machine and sew along the edges like this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and this one too. Okay, while we're there, we're also going to join our yokes to the skirts. So get your front skirt and your front yoke, pin along the edges here. Pin the back yokes to the back skirts as well. Now we'll take both the front and back pieces to our sewing machine and sew along this seam here and overlock it. Let's do that. Okay, so I finished with all that, and I went ahead and ironed all my skirt pieces, ironing the seam for the yoke up, okay, like this. Next, take your waist tie pieces and just cut in the corners to reduce bulk. So what we need to do now is to try and turn this to the right side. Now take this to your iron and just iron it flat, making sure that this bottom seam here is right at the edge. Okay, you just roll the fabric like I'm doing here to make sure that it's at the edge whilst you're ironing it. Let's do that. Okay, so that's done, nicely ironed and neat. Get your front skirt and lay it with right side up pin the raw side of your waist tie onto the edge of the skirt here, matching with the notches that we put for our pattern. Take this to the sewing machine and just give it a stitch in here so that we can hold this together so that it's easy to maneuver when we are working on the skirt. So just sew along here with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Okay, so that's done. The waist ties are all attached to the sides like this. Now take your back skirt pieces and go and overlock along the center back seam here. When you finish with that, put the skirts right sides together like this. And just sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance from the zipper notch going down. Then from there, just apply your invisible zipper. I'm just gonna go and do all that now. Okay, so I'm finished with inserting my zipper. Now get your front piece and lay it on top of the back piece, making sure that the waist ties are out of the way, and just pin it all along the side seams. Now take this to the sewing machine and sew along the side seams and overlock them. Okay, so we've done that. We've sewn all the side seams together and we overlocked it as well. So I'll put this on the side for now. Now grab your other set of yoke. We're gonna be using this as our facing, okay? So what you're gonna do is to make sure that you interface all these three pieces like I've done with mine here. So just pin them together like I'm doing here, matching the side seams. Now take them to the sewing machine and just stitch along the side seams here with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. At the same time, whilst you're at the machine, just make sure to overlock the bottom part of it. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so I've done that and overlocked the edge, and I went ahead and ironed this open as well. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is to get our skirt and turn it to the right side. Open your zipper. Now open your zipper like this, and then just mesh the edges and pin right round the waistline. Okay. So now we're gonna take this to the sewing machine, and what we are going to do is to open your zipper like this, match the seams, okay, and just pin along. So now we're going to the sewing machine and sew along this seam here, turn over to the waistline here, do the whole waistline, and turn again here and finish here. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so we finished sewing on our facings onto the skirt. So next what we're gonna do is to clip around the edges here. Okay, let's do that. Now what you're gonna do is to take the skirt again with your seam facing up like this. Just roll your facing on top of it like I'm doing here, and then sew as much as you can and under stitching here so that this can roll nicely into the skirt. Let's do that. Okay, now I've done the under stitching. I don't know if you can see it right round as much as I can. Just cut a little bit of bulk off the corners there, and we're going to just turn the skirt to the right side. Now take this to your iron and iron it nicely so that this lays nice and flat. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so our skirt is nicely ironed and flat. So what you're gonna do now is to hold the facing, making sure the seam allowance here is ironed upwards. Make sure it's covered. So just go through the front here and just stitch in the ditch here, making sure to catch the facing. So do it here on the side seam and the other side seam as well, okay, so that it holds everything together nicely. When we finish with that, we're going to hem our skirt. So just overlock right round and then just turn it once and top stitch it at 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm gonna do that now. Okay, so my skirt is nicely finished now, and I went ahead and I hemmed it nicely and pressed it as well. So that's it. I'm so happy with my skirt. Thank you.